Hello, my friend. Welcome to your sleep story. My name is Stephen Dalton. I'm an Irish storyteller, and it's my great privilege to be the voice that you listen to as you go to sleep tonight. Tonight I continue my incredibly dull history series, and you might say that tonight's topic is quite apt for a sleep story. For tonight, I will tell you the long and incredibly dull, but sometimes not, history of the bed. We will travel all the way back to when humans lay on assembled leaves, to the Egyptians and the Romans, to Louis XIV, all the way to our modern age. And as you move towards sleep tonight, I'd love to know where you are in the world. Let me know in the comments and what time it is with you. Okay, let's do the relaxation session now, which will take a few minutes before tonight's sleep story. I'm going to count down from 10 to 1, and as I do, allow yourself to let go more and more. 10. Feel the support of the bed beneath you, or the floor, or whatever surface you lie on tonight. And beneath all of that, feel the support of the earth, that deep, grounding support, that constant support, that unchanging, reassuring support that comes from our home, the earth. And as you become aware of it, see if you can release a little more. Let go a little more. 9. Feel into your body now. Where are you still holding? Where do you feel tension? Perhaps you feel pain. Maybe it's in your toes or your feet. Maybe it's in your lower legs. Maybe your thighs or your belly. Maybe you're holding in your chest. Or maybe you're like me and you hold too much tension in your hands or your face. And as you lie here now, and as you become aware of this tension or holding on, notice the release that comes with awareness. Just let go now. 8. You are safe. Allow my voice to be a friend tonight, to be a gentle guide. Know that my voice will only ever take you to safe places. See if you can find the peace in that fact. See if you can find the trust. See if you can notice that when we feel safe, we can become curious, and we can feel a little light of joy within our hearts as we move closer and closer to sleep. 7. The day is done. Whatever has been, and whatever will be, will be. Whatever thoughts arrive with you tonight, just notice them for what they are. Thoughts, a part of being human, but not you. You are not your thoughts. You don't have to follow them. They don't have to lead your emotions. And so if and when they come, and they will, let them float away now, like leaves on a moonlit river, or clouds passing by through a starlit sky. 6. This is your moment. This is your time. Allow that fact to enable you to settle in now, to feel cozy now, to feel the warmth and joy of the ability to just lie here and hear a cozy story. 5. Peace lives within you. It is always there. It is just waiting to be found, waiting to be felt. And so see if you can find that peace within you tonight. 4. Perhaps allow a little gratitude now. Gratitude for the simple things. The shelter you have tonight. The breath in your body. 3. Begin to engage with your imagination now. Begin to see the humble bed, not in its modern form. Let's go back in history and see that the bed came from very humble origins, out in nature, under the stars. 2. Checking in with your body one more time now. Your body has worked hard for you today. It's time to give it rest. And 1. completely letting go now as I tell you tonight's sleep story. Welcome to a very long and unnecessarily thorough account of the world's most peaceful invention. Part 1, in which absolutely nothing happens quickly. There are few objects in human history that have remained so fundamentally cherished, so universally necessary, and so blissfully unhurried in their development as the bed. The wheel may have changed transportation, fire may have altered the course of dinner, but the bed, the bed, has been quietly improving at an almost suspiciously leisurely pace for well over 9,000 years. It has never rushed. It has never tried to reinvent itself with urgency. It has never panicked. It has simply waited patiently through the centuries, collecting small refinements like dust motes drifting onto a well-worn quilt. The very earliest beds, if one may stretch the word bed to its loosest and leafiest limits, were little more than plant piles, grass, leaves, a thoroughly chosen patch of moss. Some of the cleverer early humans, those living somewhere in what is now South Africa, seemed to favor a particular technique. First, laying down a layer of wood ash, then arranging fragrant, insect-repelling leaves on top. It's an admirable bit of layering, considering these were people who had not yet discovered the joys of a firm pillow, or the luxury of a tucked-in sheet. This ancient bedding arrangement, some 200,000 years old, was discovered beneath a rock shelter and has delighted archaeologists for years. It was large enough for several people to lie down at once, or for one very tired person to lie in the shape of a starfish. And though there is no written evidence of dreams during this era, one imagines that a day spent foraging might produce quite peaceful, if thematically bland, nocturnal imagery. Now, the notion of the raised bed, that is, a sleeping platform that gently lifts one off the ground, also appears here for the first time. Not raised by much, mind you, only a few inches at best. But even that small elevation would have felt rather grand, like a private balcony from which one could view the twilight of the savannah. It is not hard to imagine someone lying in such a leafy arrangement, glancing over at their neighbor's bedding and thinking, I might add a bit more height tomorrow. And that is how the history of the bed begins. Not with a bang, nor even a whimper, but with the faint rustling of someone trying to make their leaf pile marginally comfier. Thousands of years passed. Yes, thousands. Because no one, it seems, was in any hurry to make major innovations in horizontal comfort. For generations, people continued to sleep on simple arrangements of natural material, bundles of straw, furs laid across stone slabs, or grass woven into gently collapsing mats. These sleeping spots were not marketed. They had no brand names, no memory foam, no anti-sag guarantee. They simply were, and that was enough. Eventually, though, slowly, softly, as with all great human endeavors, someone, somewhere, must have said, "What if we put legs on it?" It is one of history's most soothing thoughts. And so we arrive, by no means quickly, at the raised wooden bed. Part 2, in which the bed develops legs, and nobody panics. The idea of lifting one's sleeping surface off the ground, though simple in theory, took rather a long time to catch on. Human beings are not always quick to change their habits, especially when those habits involve lying down and doing absolutely nothing. For millennia, the ground had done a passable job. It had always been there, reliably flat and generously roomy. But at some point, no one knows exactly when, and certainly no one wrote it down, someone decided that they were simply too important, or perhaps just too chilly, to sleep on the ground anymore. And so, in the slow cradle of civilization, among the silted riverbanks of Mesopotamia, there appeared something revolutionary. A wooden frame, raised, with legs. Not dramatic legs, not flamboyant or scrolling or gilded legs. No, these were sensible, stout little stumps of wood They did not swivel. They did not squeak. They simply stood there, doing what legs do best, lifting someone gently up and holding it steady. The earliest Mesopotamian beds, as best we can reconstruct, were somewhat austere. They were not the sort of thing you'd lounge on with a novel and a cup of mint tea. But they did, for the first time in human history, look like beds. The rectangular wooden frame, the four legs, perhaps even a little bit of rope or twine strung across to form a base for some kind of mat or woven surface. It wasn't luxurious, but it was a start. It was, in its way, quietly thrilling. Archaeologists believe these early beds were used by the well-off priests, merchants, kings, and people who were probably too tired from inventing writing to sleep on the ground like everybody else. In fact, beds began to serve not just as sleeping surfaces, but as gentle statements of status. To own a bed with legs in 2000 BC was to declare, without saying a word, I am no longer a ground sleeper. Some Mesopotamian beds were placed on raised platforms within the room itself, an early form of stage, if you like. You would step up to your bed as if you were arriving at a minor ceremony. There may have been footstools involved, perhaps even a servant to tuck something in. It is possible, though not confirmed, that someone, somewhere, uttered the first known version of the phrase, "Ah, that's better." The bed, now that it had been lifted off the floor, became more than a pile. It became an object. It became something that could be designed, positioned, admired, or, when necessary, moved from one corner of the room to another. This was no small thing. A ground mat does not move, but a bed with legs, now that could be rearranged, reconsidered, even fluffed. Of course, the mattress as we know it was still a long way off. These early beds would have supported some sort of mat, perhaps filled with straw, reeds, or wool, depending on the sleeper's station in life. There was no foam, no stuffing made from space-age polymers, but there may have been something like a cushion, and that cushion may have been pressed and patted nightly by someone who had begun to notice this is comfortable. Comfort, as a concept, was beginning to evolve, and the bed was quietly at the center of it. Even the act of lying down was changing. It was no longer a simple collapse onto grass or hide. It was becoming a small ritual, a thing done with intention. One approached the bed. One sat gently. One adjusted. One sighed. One, this was new, had a preferred side. Part 3, in which the bed becomes elegant and slightly angled for reasons no one quite understands. Egypt, by the time beds truly arrived, was already rather good at being a civilization. It had pyramids, calendars, papyrus, and a healthy respect for the afterlife. And while the Mesopotamians had quietly lifted their bedding off the ground and gone to sleep with barely a fuss, the Egyptians made a bit more of it. An Egyptian bed, particularly one from the higher ranks of society, was a thing of beauty, made from wood, often acacia or ebony, sometimes imported at great expense. It was shaped with care. 4 legs, yes, but no longer the chunky stumps of earlier days. These legs were thinner, sometimes curved, occasionally shaped like animal limbs. It is entirely possible that some beds stood on lions' paws or cows' hooves, depending on the mood of the carpenter. The structure itself was no longer flat. Egyptian beds often sloped gently downward, from head to foot. Why? No one is absolutely sure. Some say it was for drainage. Others say it helped with posture. Still others suggest it simply looked impressive. And perhaps that was reason enough. There's something undeniably dignified about a piece of furniture that declines ever so slightly toward the horizon. Atop this elegant incline, there was no pillow as we know it. Instead, the Egyptians used headrests, curved slabs of wood or stone, propped up at either end. They were not, in any traditional sense, soft, but they lifted the head just enough to maintain one's hairstyle overnight. which, it turns out, was often the point. If you had just spent several hours oiling, braiding, and adorning your head with beads, you didn't want to wake up looking like you'd slept on it. And so, the headrest was born. The mattress, or what passed for one, was likely made from woven reeds or plant fibers, stretched tightly against the frame. Some may have included padding, possibly layers of linen or palm fronds. Linen itself, spun from flax and bleached in the sun, was the fabric of choice for the wealthy. Cool, crisp, and surprisingly durable. It was considered both practical and pure. A fine bed in Egypt might therefore have featured a woven platform, a few carefully folded linen sheets, a carved wooden frame, and a gently sloping surface. But here's the most telling detail. Beds weren't only for the living. The tomb of Tutankhamun, discovered in 1922, contained 3 separate beds, each folded like a camp bed. Evidence, perhaps, that even in the afterlife, one might wish for options. These beds were gilded and ornately designed, with animal motifs and intricate joinery. No one was going to use them, at least not physically. But the point had been made. The bed had arrived as a symbol of rest, of status, of continuity between this world and whatever came next. It was also around this time that beds began to be positioned deliberately, not just shoved into the corner or plopped beside the fire, but placed with intention. Some were aligned with stars, others with the rising sun. Bedrooms, if one can call them that, were beginning to form around the bed, not the other way around. Still, most people in Egypt did not sleep on golden frames. The majority made do with woven mats or modest wooden planks, likely softened with whatever cloth could be spared. But the idea of the bed was spreading. It was becoming desirable. It had grown legs, then slope, and now a little bit of grandeur. Next, we'll lie down with the Greeks, and then the Romans, who were terribly clever and saw no reason not to eat while reclining. The bed will evolve again into something sociable, philosophical, and just a touch too relaxed for cutlery. Part 4, in which the Greeks decide to recline for everything. It is said though the source is vague and the tone unreliable, that a certain philosopher in Athens once held an entire lecture from his bed. Whether it was Plato or a man very much like him, no one now recalls. But the story goes that his students arrived early, scrolls in hand, prepared to sit attentively on low stools beneath the olive trees. Instead, they found their teacher horizontal, comfortably so, on a low, elegant couch, draped in a linen wrap, gesturing vaguely toward the ceiling with one hand and cradling a peeled fig in the other. "Today," he said, "we shall contemplate virtue, but we shall not do it standing up. This may not be strictly verifiable, but it captures something fundamental about the Greek relationship to the bed. They were not in a rush to separate rest from reason." The ancient Greek bed, known as the kline, was not quite the same as a modern sleeping bed. It was a hybrid creature, half bed, half couch. It served multiple functions. Sleeping, certainly, but also lounging, eating, debating, sulking, recovering from dinner, or composing odes to olive oil. It was, in short, the earliest recorded version of the all-day bed. A typical kline was made of wood, often with carved legs and a frame, into which woven supports or a firm mattress might be laid. Bedding included cloths or throws, and possibly cushions, though the Greeks, like the Egyptians, had not yet succumbed to the excesses of pillow proliferation. Beds were elevated slightly off the ground, not for any particular symbolic reason, but because it simply made sense to sit and lie without the effort of full descent. In wealthier homes, these kline were placed in dining rooms, androns, in a very particular formation. The room would be laid out with multiple couches along 3 sides of a square, with the 4th side left open for serving food. This was not mere practicality. It was theater. Each guest would recline sideways, propped on one elbow, leaving the other hand free for grapes, wine, or idle gesturing. The practice of reclining while dining, known as symposia, became so deeply woven into Greek culture that standing to eat was seen as either suspicious or hurried. reclining suggested leisure, thoughtfulness, perhaps even a bit of aristocratic flair. If you must eat, the furniture seemed to say, do it slowly, and preferably while making a point about Homer. We do have fragmentary records of Greek beds, including inventories of household goods on inscribed tablets. One such list from the 4th century BCE mentions 2 clini, 1 new, 1 damaged, 1 small table, 6 vessels, and a small bronze mirror. It is not a thrilling document, but it tells us this much. Beds were considered worth mentioning. They were valuable enough to record, and common enough to require counting. There are also depictions of beds and couches in Greek vase paintings, stylized scenes of people reclining, drinking, listening to music, or being offered fruit by their servants. Interestingly, the Greeks seem to have had no particular ritual around going to bed. One simply moved from reclining in conversation to reclining in silence. The same piece of furniture might host a political debate at dusk, and a full 8 hours of dreamless slumber by midnight. There was no need to overcomplicate things. As for the mattress, such as it was, these were typically stuffed with straw, wool, or leaves. Linen sheets were used when available, and in colder months, woolen blankets were added. There is little evidence of elaborate bedding arrangements, though one must imagine that a well-wrapped Greek, drifting off under the stars in a breezy courtyard, would have been content enough. Next, we will roll gently as ever over to Rome, where the cline becomes the lectus, and the bed continues its transformation from humble rest station to imperial indulgence. The Romans, it turns out, were even less interested in verticality than their Greek predecessors. Part 5, in which the Romans perfect the recline and the bed becomes a lifestyle. By the time the Romans began importing ideas from Greece, as they famously did with everything from architecture to gods, they had already grasped the essential point of the cline, that lying down, when done with confidence, could be considered a form of civilization. The Romans renamed it the lectus and promptly expanded its role in society. It was no longer just a place to sleep or eat. It became a platform for demonstrating Roman values: comfort, wealth, family, and power. A lectus could be found in nearly every Roman home. In simpler households, it was a modest wooden frame with rope or leather straps crisscrossing to support a mattress filled with straw or wool. In more affluent villas, however, the lectus took on an almost architectural quality. It might have legs, carved in the shape of mythological beasts, inlaid ivory panels, or bronze feet polished until they gleamed like the family reputation. There were lecti for every occasion. The lectus cubicularis was the bedroom bed, used exclusively for sleep and personal rest. The lectus genialis was the marital bed, often found in the atrium, placed beneath an image of the household gods. The lectus tricliniaris was the dining couch, used in the famed triclinium or dining room, where guests reclined in threes, arranged in a U shape around a central table. The configuration of these dining couches was so specific that etiquette books, yes, they existed, offered guidance on which position implied honor, which implied servitude, and which seat allowed for easiest grape access. There were left couches, right couches, and the coveted medium lectus, the central spot where the guest of honor was expected to say something witty between mouthfuls of food. It is important to pause here and appreciate just how slowly this transformation happened. The Roman bed did not appear suddenly. It did not arrive with a fanfare or a cushion drop. It crept into Roman life the way warm water creeps into a bath, gradually, until one is surprised to find oneself warm and comfortable. The Roman mattress, still not sprung, of course, was typically stuffed with wool, hay, or feathers. Wealthier Romans preferred goose down. Poorer Romans may have used whatever was available, including bundled straw or moss. There was no such thing as a standard size. The bed was made to fit the room, the sleeper, and the prevailing opinion on how far one should fall if turning too enthusiastically in the night. Sheets were usually linen or wool, and colored textiles were becoming more common. Dyes were prized. Red, green, even purple, if you had the means. A well-made Roman bed could be as bright as it was uncomfortable. One amusing account, recorded in the Satyricon by Petronius, describes a dinner guest so overstuffed with food that he rolls sideways off the lectus and lands on the floor with all the dignity of a dropped fig. The scene is comic and no doubt fictionalized, but it reminds us these beds, for all their cultural significance, were not always practical. Still, the Romans adored them. There were even beds for the dead. Roman tombs often included carved stone versions of the lectus, sculpted in eternal recline. One might lie forever beside a goblet, a book, and a small stone dog. A peaceful tableau. In our next part, we shall move forward very slowly, like someone getting out of bed on a cold morning, into the medieval world, where the bed becomes bigger, heavier, darker, and surrounded by an increasing number of curtains. Part 6, in which the bed gains curtains, becomes enormous, and begins to groan under its own importance. By the time the Romans had passed the torch of history to the medieval world, reluctantly and with a bit of flair, the bed had become something more than just a place to lie down. It was now an object of significance, especially for those few who had both land and furniture. In the early Middle Ages, roughly from the 5th to the 10th centuries, the notion of privacy was still rather vague. Houses, where they existed at all, were usually one-room affairs. People cooked, worked, talked, slept, gave birth, and in some cases held village meetings, all in the same room. And so, if you were lucky enough to have a bed, it often had a very specific architectural feature: curtains. Curtains, it turns out, are among the most underappreciated inventions in the history of sleep. They were not yet dainty or decorative. No lace, no tiebacks. These were thick woolen hangings, sometimes lined with fur, and they served one glorious purpose: to stop the wind from visiting your toes at 3 a.m. A medieval bed with curtains could be magnificent. It might have tall wooden posts at each corner, carved, if the owner could afford it, with leaves, vines, lions, or saints. These were called four-posters, and they were both status symbol and survival mechanism. The curtain rods crisscrossed above the bed, forming what one might generously call a sleep enclosure, though it could just as easily be called a small wooden house within a slightly larger wooden house. Inside this sleeping booth, one could enjoy a marginal improvement in warmth, a significant improvement in privacy, and the comforting sensation of sleeping in what essentially amounted to a woolly box. Let us be clear. Most people still did not sleep in such grandeur. The average peasant or laborer had a straw mattress, known in some regions as a pallet, laid directly on the floor or on a basic frame made of rope or planks. The term sleep tight is sometimes said to come from the act of tightening the ropes beneath a mattress to keep it firm. But this is one of those folk etymologies best enjoyed with a shrug. It may be true, it may not. Either way, it's a lovely image. Someone yawning, stooping to adjust their ropes before tucking in. For the wealthy, however, the bed was taking en masse. The mattresses were now layered with feathers, straw, or wool, depending on the season. Some beds were so large that they required steps to climb into. The great bed of ware, constructed a few centuries later, famously measured over 10 feet across and could sleep multiple couples at once, though it was mostly used as an attraction in a coaching inn, and possibly for gossip more than sleep. There were no standardized bedding sizes. One could not ask for a double or a queen. One simply slept on whatever width of surface the carpenter had considered adequate. In wealthier homes, the sheets were linen, sometimes embroidered with the family crest. Blankets might be wool or fur. The pillows were firm and occasionally shared. An English inventory from the 13th century lists one noble's bedroom as containing a feather bed, 3 pillows, 2 bolster cushions, 6 linen sheets, 1 woolen blanket, 1 quilt of red samite, and a carved headboard bearing the arms of the house. No mention is made of the mattress firmness, but one imagines it was somewhere between resolute and gently unforgiving. And here we must pause, just for a moment, to reflect on the communal nature of medieval sleep. For it was not uncommon for several people to sleep in the same bed, especially in winter. Family members, traveling guests, visiting clergy, even servants, might all share the same sleeping space. This was not unusual. It was simply practical. Beds were warmer when shared, and fireplaces were expensive. But still, the curtains, they hung, they swayed, they muffled. They created the illusion, however temporary, of a private world, a world of warmth and wood smoke, of gentle breathing, of sleep without the sensation of being watched by 6 others. In the next part, we shall creep forward into the Renaissance, where the bed becomes a canvas for embroidery, an object of poetry, and, for the first time, a thing that one might inherit with pride. Part 7, in which the bed inherits velvet, verses, and the occasional human being. By the Renaissance, or Renaissance, depending where you're from, roughly the 15th and 16th centuries, the bed had become something more than a practical place to collapse. It had begun to shimmer faintly with importance. A Renaissance bed could now be beautiful, not just useful, not merely warm, but decorated, admired, and, if one's finances allowed, bequeathed. This was the first time in European history that beds were routinely mentioned in wills. People didn't just use their beds, they passed them on. To my eldest son, one might write, the tall bed with walnut carvings, 2 bolster cushions, and the counterpane stitched with the lilies of Florence. Not because the son needed a bed, but because that bed had become something worth keeping. It is easy, when writing about the history of beds, to become so preoccupied with linen thread counts and oak joinery that one forgets the most obvious fact. The bed is often where humans begin. Pretty much always has been, and never more so than in this age, when beds were central to the home, the hearth, and the very idea of family. A Renaissance bed, particularly in a noble household, was not just a sleeping space. It was a ceremonial stage. It stood high, very high, on a raised platform. It was surrounded by richly embroidered curtains, dyed with deep, dignified colors, burgundy, navy, golden ochre. The headboard might be carved with mythological scenes, saints, or classical motifs. And upon this stage, in the soft hush of candlelight, generations quietly began. Children were born in beds, heirs, surprises, twins, long hoped for daughters. Beds were not spoken of in poetic terms very often, but poets did speak of what happened next, the life, the inheritance, the continuing thread of a family line. One didn't need to describe the bed in such poems. Its presence was understood. It was the quiet witness, the beginning of most stories, and the end of some too. In portraits from the period, the bed often appears in the background, not quite the subject, but impossible to ignore. You might see it tucked behind a lace veil in the portrait of a mother, or looming like a throne behind a seated nobleman, reminding the viewer gently that wealth wasn't truly secured until it had a place to rest. The mattress was now a considerable object in its own right, feather-filled, button-tufted, often covered with a fitted sheet of fine linen. Over this would lie a woolen blanket or a heavy counterpane, often woven with heraldic symbols or biblical scenes. A bed in Florence or Bruges might contain the entire family crest, painstakingly stitched into a cover that would never see daylight beyond the bedroom window. And still, curtains. These too had evolved. They no longer merely shielded the sleeper from drafts. They now added mystery. They could be drawn closed at night, not just to keep out the cold, but to mark a boundary, to signal that this space, within this velvet-draped rectangle of privacy, belonged to those inside it. The bed was now a vessel for sleep, yes, for restoration, but also for continuation, for family, for weaving together bloodlines and futures, without needing to declare itself. The bed had become the place where humans arrived and where, for many, they would one day leave. And so, it was treated accordingly. Clean linens, freshened feathers, polished wood, and most significantly, care. People looked after their beds. They turned the mattresses. They shook out the blankets. They embroidered initials into pillowcases. A bed was not disposable. It was not a cheap item to be replaced. It was, often, the most valuable thing a household owned, and it held, in its padded silence, the proof that people had lived. In our next part, we shall step softly into the 17th and 18th centuries, where beds grow even grander and begin to feature in royal protocol, bedroom architecture, and the rise of the morning audience, a peculiar practice in which important people received visitors while still in bed, as if rising were no longer strictly necessary. Part 8, in which the bed becomes a stage, a status symbol, and occasionally a venue for government affairs. By the 1600s, the bed had grown so tall, so layered, so magnificently enrobed in velvet and tassels, that it was sometimes difficult to determine whether it was meant for sleeping or for holding a small coronation. In noble houses and palaces, the bed was no longer just a private affair. It had entered public life, not entirely, and not for everyone, but in certain rarefied circles, being in bed did not exclude you from receiving guests. In fact, in some cases, it encouraged it. At the French court, particularly under Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, it became customary for the monarch to hold a morning ceremony known as the lever, which translates roughly as the rising. During this ritual, courtiers would gather in the royal bedchamber, not to admire the wallpaper, but to witness the king being gently awakened, washed, and dressed. The bed, in this context, was not just a bed. It was a throne that happened to lie down. It was a velvet-lined platform of state. It was also, in some ways, a piece of theatre. Heavy curtains would be drawn back. The monarch, suitably rehearsed, would yawn. A footman would fluff. A duke would clear his throat and offer a perfectly neutral observation about the weather. And beneath it all, the mattress, still feather-filled, still hand-tufted, and now often so deep that one could lose a modest bracelet in its depths. Beds in this period were high enough that steps were sometimes required. There were portable stair stools, carved and upholstered, just to allow a person of moderate height to reach their own quilt. Pillows multiplied, bolsters thickened, canopies rose overhead like fabric cathedrals. The bed, at this point, had entered a kind of peak expression, a golden age of flounce and drapery. But even in more modest households, the bed continued its quiet importance. In England, for example, household inventories from the 17th century frequently list beds as among the most valuable possessions. One feather bed, 2 bolsters, 3 blankets, a counterpane of green serge, and a tester with matching hangings. The tester, in this case, was the wooden frame above the bed from which curtains would hang. A kind of canopy, a ceiling for sleep. Some beds had headboards carved with biblical scenes, others with floral designs or geometric patterns. Some had family crests, others bore nothing at all, save for the smooth wear of time and use. But whatever the decoration, the bed was understood to be central, not just physically, but emotionally. It was where one went in illness, in worry, in winter. And yes, as before, it remained the place where generations began and ended. Weddings in this era often involved a ceremonial bedding, not always literal, but symbolically significant. The idea of the marital bed as the starting place of a new household was deeply ingrained. To be bedded was to be properly joined. It was also the first shared object of a couple's life together, and likely the most comfortable. Meanwhile, the middle and merchant classes, growing in wealth and numbers, began to take cues from aristocratic trends. Upholstery grew richer, linens became finer, decorative hangings, once the preserve of dukes and duchesses, began to appear in the parlours and upstairs rooms of people who now had servants to wash them. And still, the bed was made. That small ritual, stretching the sheet, shaking the pillows, folding back the coverlet, became one of the few shared customs across every class of society. Whether one slept on a grand four-poster in Versailles, or on a rope-strung frame in a country inn, the bed was tidied. It was fluffed. It was prepared, as if each evening were a quiet performance, and each sleeper the star. In the next section, we shall stroll gently into the 19th century, where industrialization begins to change what beds are made of, how they're sold, and who, for the first time, might walk into a shop and say, "I'll take that one." Part 9, in which the bed goes industrial, but still keeps its quilts on. It is a peculiar thing to imagine a bed being manufactured. For centuries, beds had been handmade, handcrafted, or at the very least, hand-stuffed. They were the work of carpenters, upholsterers, weavers, and patient needle hands, all combining to create something that felt, despite its purpose, quite alive. But in the 1800s, beds began to arrive in the world somewhat differently. They began to come in catalogues. Thanks to the steady march of industry, the bed, once a singular household heirloom, passed reverently down from great aunt to great nephew, could now be ordered. You could browse. You could compare. You could, in theory, return one if the springs were too judgmental. Springs, in fact, are the great mechanical revelation of this period. The coil spring mattress, first patented in the mid-1800s, offered a new kind of sleep, a bounce, a give, a previously unknown sensation of resistance, followed by agreement, The earliest spring mattresses were not entirely trustworthy. Some were too tight, some too loose, some made unhelpful noises, but the idea had taken hold. A bed might now respond. There were naturally debates. Some insisted that the firmness of straw was better for the back. Others complained that the springs made them feel as though they were sleeping on a musical instrument. But slowly, steadily, the spring bed caught on, especially among the growing middle class, who saw it in a kind of modern elegance. The future, they thought, might just be coiled. Bed frames changed too. Iron and brass entered the scene. Wood was still common, especially dark, polished mahogany. But metal offered something new. Standardization. The iron bed could be mass-produced. It was sturdy and endlessly repaintable. A typical Victorian bedroom might feature a black iron bed with a coverlet, lace trim, 2 pillows, and an alarming number of decorative cushions that served no clear purpose but appeared to be compulsory. Quilts were common, hand-stitched, often patchworked, occasionally made with scraps of family fabric in the shape of a heart, a star, or a diamond that looked vaguely like a cloud. The bed had also, by now, acquired a sense of decorum. No longer was it acceptable to leave a bed unmade, at least not in the presence of guests. Morning rituals included drawing open the curtains, smoothing the coverlet, and placing the bolster pillow squarely in the center. Bedrooms became more private. The idea of receiving visitors in bed, once the height of aristocratic ease, had now become something slightly awkward. Beds were for families, for rest, for the hidden rhythm of daily life. And yet, the symbolism remained. Victorian literature is full of beds. Deathbeds, sick beds, wedding beds, beds where characters long for things, remember things, recover from things. The bed is never the focus of the story, but it is always there, holding the weight of it. Even in Dickens, where rooms are often cold, and coal scuttles prominent. The bed provides a kind of center, however lumpy, however brief. Children's beds became a thing of particular attention. Small wooden cribs, later painted iron cuts, and eventually beds with side rails, stuffed toys, and little embroidered pillowcases. The nursery bed became its own quiet kingdom, tucked away in an upstairs room where lullabies echoed faintly beneath the floorboards. And so, even in the midst of industrial bustle, the bed held its ground. It absorbed the modern age without losing its softness. It took in iron, springs, standard sizing, and pillow shams. But still it remained what it had always been, the one place in the house where you were allowed, without guilt or explanation, to do absolutely nothing. In our next section, we will wander into the 20th century, where advertising arrives, branding begins, and beds are no longer just bought, but marketed, named, and tested by people in lab coats, measuring lumbar zones. Part 10, in which the bed enters the modern age and we all lie down. And so we come, at last, to now. The age of zipped covers, of adjustable frames, of advertisements that promise the perfect night's sleep in just 6 easy payments. We live in a time where beds have names, not just bed or the one by the radiator, but things like the Cloud Lift 3000 or the Slumber Elite. There are beds made of memory foam, latex, organic hemp, activated charcoal, and things that sound like they belong more in a volcano than a bedroom. There are mattresses that arrive in boxes the size of a fridge and slowly unfold like a towel learning to breathe. The modern bed has been measured, mapped, diagrammed, and discussed. It is no longer a humble frame and a sack of feathers. It is a science project. Sleep experts speak of pressure points, spinal alignment, and sleep temperature. Mattress reviews read like wine tastings, firm but yielding, excellent edge support, a hint of eucalyptus. But beneath all of this, beneath the branding and the buzzwords, the bed remains what it has always been, a place to lie down, a place to let the day end, a place to be safely, blissfully horizontal. It is perhaps time to gently note something else. This story, from the leafy mats of prehistory to the spring-loaded sprawl of the 21st century, has largely followed one path, a Western one, not by neglect, but by nature. It is a story of raised wooden frames, 4 posters, feather beds, and fuss. But in much of the world, particularly in Eastern traditions, the history of the bed followed another rhythm entirely. In Japan, for instance, the futon, not to be confused with its chunkier Western cousin, is still commonly laid out each night and folded away each morning. No legs, no springs, just layers of cotton batting on a tatami mat. In many parts of China, especially in rural areas, beds were once made atop heated brick platforms called kang, multifunctional spaces used for sleeping, sitting, eating, and warming the bones in winter. In India, the traditional charpai remains, a woven rope bed on a wooden frame, breathable in summer, easy to carry, and endlessly repairable. These traditions never saw the bed as a permanent object dominating the room. Instead, the sleeping surface was something woven into the rhythm of the home, unrolled, used, and respectfully returned to its place. No box springs, no bed skirts, no endless debates about thread count. And even today, in many parts of the world, people sleep on mats, floor coverings, simple blankets, or little else. Not because they lack comfort, but because comfort does not always require height or fuss. Sometimes it is found in cool air, in quiet, in familiarity. Sometimes it is enough just to lie down. But this story, this one you've been listening to tonight, has stayed closer to Well, where I grew up, it has walked the path of carved posts and linen sheets, of duchesses with bolster cushions, and grandfathers tightening rope frames, because in this part of the world, the western one, our beds have become something between furniture and inheritance. They are where we go when the day is done, where we retreat when we are ill or tired or small. They are where we read and nap and lie with someone we love. They are the first place we ever feel safe in, and often the last. These days, you can order a bed online. You can track its shipping. You can watch a man in a video explain how many inches deep the foam goes and why it's infused with bamboo. You can compare models. You can read 147 five-star reviews from people who have had their beds for 3 days and are already in love. And yet, when you lie down, none of that matters. You don't think about springs or stitching or the noble lineage of mattress manufacture. You just feel the pull of rest, the gentle sigh of gravity. The long, slow unspooling of everything you carried through the day. And in that moment, the bed does what it has always done. From the Mesopotamians to the Greeks to the French nobles to you, it holds you. Quietly, comfortably, without asking anything in return. That is the history of the bed, or at least the incredibly dull version of it. And as you lie in your bed, or whatever surface you lie upon tonight, I wish you peace. I hope that you appreciate the great history that you lie upon tonight. Sleep well.